Out here in the Texas Panhandle, silence isn't golden. Silence is a warning. Elias Monroe knew that better than any man alive. He leaned against his barn door, rifle cradled in his arm, and stared at the horizon. The sky was a bruised purple, pressing down on the flat earth like a tombstone. For 3 years since Mary died, the silence had been his only company. It was a lonely sound, the creak of wood, the whistle of wind through the rafters. But this was different. This was a heavy silence, a watchful silence. His cattle felt it. They'd been restless all morning, their eyes wide and wild, sniffing at the air for a predator they couldn't see. Elias had ridden the fence line twice, checking for wolves, for anything out of place. He'd found nothing, but the feeling didn't leave. It clung to him like the October frost, cold and sharp. He told himself he was being a fool. A lonely man's mind plays tricks. Still, he saddled his mare, Daisy, and rode out. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for work, for the familiar ache in his muscles that could chase the ghosts away. Daisy carried him toward the edge of his land, toward the old chapel. It stood in ruins, blackened stones like broken teeth against the gray sky. A fire had taken it 5 years back. The folks in Amarillo built a new church, closer to town, but Elias never trusted it. He still said his prayers in his kitchen, the way his father had taught him. That's when he saw it. A heap of something near the collapsed wall. Just a pile of rags, maybe, or a calf tangled in the brush. But Daisy knew better. She snorted, her ears pinning back, refusing to take another step. And in that moment, the shape became clear. It wasn't rags. It wasn't a calf. It was a person. His hand tightened on his rifle. Out here, 36 miles from anywhere, a stranger was bad news. Strangers meant questions. Questions meant trouble. And trouble, more often than not, ended in blood. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the frosted ground. This wasn't some drifter sleeping off a bottle. It was a woman. "Hello there," he called out, his voice steady. The wind tore the words from his lips. She didn't move. He got closer, and his breath hitched in his throat. She was young, maybe 25. Her dark hair was matted with dirt and something else. Something dark. Her face was a canvas of bruises, purple and yellow. Her feet, bare to the frost, were a mottled, deathly blue, and she was clutching a filthy wool blanket to her chest, clinging to it like it was the only thing left in the world. He knelt beside her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. He felt it then. A pulse, faint and fluttery as a trapped bird's wing. She was alive. "Miss," he said, his voice softer now. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids flickered. Her eyes opened, and Elias felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't just fear in those eyes. It was a terror so deep, so absolute, it looked like it had hollowed her soul right out. She tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. "You're safe," Elias said quickly, holding up his hands so she could see them. "I'm Elias Monroe. This is my land." She just shook her head, a tiny, weak movement, and her grip on that blanket tightened. It was a frantic, desperate gesture, as if he'd just threatened to rip it away. "I won't hurt you," he promised, his voice rough with the cold. "On my word as a Christian man." Something in his tone seemed to reach her. Her grip loosened, just a fraction. Elias slid his arms under her. She weighed nothing, a bundle of sticks and fever. As he lifted her, she buried her face deeper into that blanket, hiding from the sky, from him, from everything. The ride back to the ranch house felt like an eternity. With every single hoofbeat, the same question pounded in Elias's head. Who leaves a woman barefoot and broken in the shadow of a burned-out church? He laid her gently on the sofa by the hearth and built the fire up high. The heat filled the small room, crackling and hissing, pushing back the cold that seemed to cling to her skin. She stirred, her eyes darting from the flames to Elias, then back again, always watching, always measuring. He offered her a cup of water. She took a single sip, then turned her head away. "Easy now," he murmured. "You need to get something in you." She didn't answer. She just pulled that blanket tighter until only her eyes were visible over the edge. They were dark pools of pain and suspicion. He could see the bruises on her face more clearly now, the angry purple marks on her throat. They were shaped like fingers. Elias's stomach churned. This was no accident. He put a bowl of stew on the table near her. She stared at it, her body trembling, but made no move to take it. I don't need to know right now, he said gently. You just rest. The day crawled by. Elias did his chores, his mind 1,000 miles away. He checked the stock, mended a fence, hauled water. But every few minutes he glanced back at the house, at the window to the parlor. He could almost feel her eyes on him, even from the yard. She was like a cornered animal, watching the cage door, waiting for the moment it opened or for the trapper to return. Late that afternoon, the sound of hooves broke the silence. Dr. Harlan, from town. He'd come out to check on a sick calf Elias had mentioned a few days ago. The doctor was a good man, practical and kind. When Elias told him about the woman, his face grew serious. Let me take a look at her, Elias, Dr. Harlan said, opening his black bag. Those injuries need tending. Elias nodded, relieved. He led the doctor inside. The moment Dr. Harlan stepped toward the sofa, she reacted. No. Her voice was a shattered whisper, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. No, doctor. No. She curled into a tight ball, pulling the blanket completely over her head. Her entire body shook with a violence that startled both men. It wasn't just fear. It was pure, unadulterated panic. Dr. Harlan stopped, his hand hovering in the air. He looked at Elias, his brow furrowed with concern. Elias, she needs treatment. Those are not minor scrapes. She won't allow it, Elias said, his own voice tight. He felt torn. He wanted to help her, but forcing her felt like another violation. I'll do what I can. The doctor hesitated, then sighed, a puff of frustrated air. As you wish, but infection can set in faster than prayer, my friend. He packed his bag and left, muttering about stubborn women and the trouble they caused. Elias closed the door behind him and turned back to the parlor. She was still hidden under the blanket, but the trembling had subsided slightly. He's gone, Elias said quietly. He won't be back unless I send for him. The blanket moved. Her eyes, wide and gleaming in the firelight, appeared over the edge. They fixed on him, searching his face. For the first time since he'd found her, something shifted in her expression. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the barest flicker of something else. Maybe relief. That evening, Elias sat in his worn armchair, his Bible open on his lap. He tried to read, but the words blurred together. Every snap of the fire made him jump. Every gust of wind rattling the windows sounded like a footstep outside. He kept glancing at the sofa, at the small, huddled shape that had brought so much trouble and mystery into his quiet life. You can stay as long as you need, he said, not looking at her directly. No one's going to harm you here. A long silence followed, then a single, almost imperceptible nod. She turned her face back toward the fire. When Elias finally went to bed that night, the exhaustion was bone deep. He knelt by his bed and prayed, the way he always did. But tonight, his words were different. They weren't for a good harvest or for Mary's soul. Lord, give me wisdom, he whispered into the darkness. If this woman's burden is as dark as I fear, show me the way to help her. He had no idea that his prayer was about to be answered, not with peace, not with wisdom, but with a truth so terrible it would burn the foundations of his world to the ground. The next morning, the house was still, too still. Elias rose before dawn, the habit of a lifetime. But as he pulled on his boots, he found himself listening for a cough, a footstep, any sign of life from the other room. There was nothing, just the whisper of dying embers in the hearth. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. Had she worsened in the night? Or had she slipped away, back into the frozen plains? He stepped into the parlor. She was there, exactly as he had left her, curled on the sofa, wrapped in that filthy blanket. Her eyes were open. They were fixed on him, dark and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom. Morning, he said softly. No reply. She just watched him. He stoked the fire back to life and put a pot of stew on to warm. The smell of beef and onions filled the cabin, a scent of home, of safety. He hoped she'd see it that way. You need to eat, he said, ladling some broth into a bowl. It'll warm you. He set it on the small table beside the sofa, within her reach but not forcing it on her. Then he retreated to his own chair with a mug of coffee, giving her space. She didn't move. Her eyes darted to the bowl for a split second, then fixed back on the fire. Patience, Elias told himself. He'd survived droughts and blizzards with patience. He could survive this silence. The hours ticked by. He went about his chores, but his thoughts were tethered to the house. Every time he came back inside, she was in the same spot, her knuckles white where she gripped the blanket. And always those eyes followed him. It wasn't the look of a grateful guest. It was the look of a trapped animal calculating its chances. By late afternoon, the silence was a physical weight. It pressed down on him, suffocating. He couldn't take it anymore. "I don't know what happened to you, miss," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "And I won't pry, but you're going to die if you don't eat." Her shoulders gave a slight tremor. Her lips parted, then pressed shut again. He tried a different approach. He told her about himself, about his ranch, about Mary, about his 36 years on this lonely stretch of land. He offered up pieces of his life like a peace offering, hoping she might see he was just a man, not a monster. She just stared. As evening began to fall, he heard it again, the sound of hooves in the yard. Elias's jaw tightened. It was Dr. Harlan again. "Thought I'd check on the calf," the doctor said as he dismounted, but his eyes were on the cabin. "And your guest?" Elias wanted to tell him to leave, but refusing the town doctor twice would start talk. Talk he couldn't afford. He let him in. "Ma'am," the doctor said, his voice gentle, "I'm just here to help. Let me look at those cuts." "No!" The word was sharper this time, louder. "Please, go away." She shrank back, trying to disappear into the sofa cushions. Dr. Harlan's patience was wearing thin. "Elias, this is foolish. She's in no condition to make these decisions." "She has," Elias said, stepping between the doctor and the sofa. A line had been drawn. "And in my house, her word stands." The doctor stared at him, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. He shook his head, grabbed his hat, and left without another word. When the door closed, Elias turned back. She was watching him, her breathing ragged. The fear was still there, but beneath it was something new. Confusion. Maybe even a sliver of gratitude. He sat down and opened his Bible, the familiar way to small comfort in the turmoil. It was close to midnight when he heard the sound. Soft, muffled sobs. He put the book down and crossed the room. She had her face buried in her hands, her whole body shaking with silent grief. "Miss?" he whispered. She looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I can't stop it," she gasped. "Stop what?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "The fear?" Her voice broke. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there." She couldn't finish, but she didn't have to. Elias had seen enough cruelty in his life to fill in the blanks. The finger-shaped bruises on her neck were not from a fall. A cold, hard anger began to build in his chest. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Her eyes, filled with a terrible, knowing sadness, locked onto his. He saw her struggle, saw the words fighting to get out. Then she just shook her head. "You wouldn't believe me." "Try me," he insisted. Her lips trembled. "They're respected men," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Pillars of the community. The men who pray the loudest on Sundays." Elias went cold. The words hit him like a physical blow. Reverend Claiborne's booming sermons echoed in his head. Mayor Redford's speeches at the town square. Sheriff Wallace, the symbol of law and order in Amarillo. It couldn't be. These were the men he trusted. The men everyone trusted. But her eyes held no hint of madness. Only the hollow, broken certainty of a survivor. Before he could ask more, she pulled the blanket back over her head, shutting him out. Her voice came, muffled and full of despair, from beneath the wool. "No one ever believes women like me." The room was silent again, except for the hiss of the fire. Elias stood there, his knees aching, his mind reeling. He didn't just doubt her. For the first time in his life, he doubted everything. His town, his leaders, his church. He backed away slowly and sank into his chair. He stared into the dying flames for hours, long after she had cried herself to sleep. The woman had a name, Lydia. She whispered it to him one morning, her voice still rough as sand. Lydia Hart. He didn't know then, but that name would become a brand on his soul. A few days later, a rider approached the ranch. Elias saw him coming from a long way off. The rider sat tall in the saddle, steady and sure. This was no drifter. As he drew closer, Elias recognized the black coat, the wide-brimmed hat, his stomach twisted into a knot. It was Reverend Claiborne. The Reverend had been a comfort to him when Mary passed. He'd shared scripture and coffee in this very kitchen. But now seeing him ride up, Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Brother Monroe," Claiborne called, his voice as warm and reassuring as ever. He dismounted with practiced grace. "I heard from Dr. Harlan you'd taken in a guest. A troubled soul," he said. "Word travels fast." Elias just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "I found her by the old chapel," he managed to say. "She was near frozen." Claiborne's face arranged itself into an expression of deep, pious concern. "The poor child. May I see her? Sometimes a prayer can heal what medicine cannot." Every instinct screamed at Elias to say no, to stand in the doorway and block the path. But this was Reverend Claiborne. To refuse him would be an insult. It would raise questions Elias wasn't ready to answer. He stepped aside, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. Lydia was sitting by the fire, just as she always was. But the moment the Reverend stepped through the door, her head snapped up. A sound escaped her lips, a choked, strangled gasp. She scrambled backwards on the sofa, pressing herself into the corner as if trying to merge with the wood. Her body began to tremble violently. "Child," Claiborne said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. He took a step closer. "I am Reverend Claiborne. I've come to pray for your peace." "No!" The scream ripped through the cabin, raw and terrified. "Get away from me! Please, go away!" Elias moved instantly, placing himself between them. "That's enough, Reverend. You're frightening her." Claiborne stopped. For a split second, a look of pure fury flashed across his face, so fast Elias almost missed it. Then just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by solemn understanding. "Of course," he said smoothly. "The trauma she's endured has clearly unhinged her. I meant no harm." He placed a heavy hand on Elias's shoulder. "You're a good man for caring for her, Elias. But be cautious. Sometimes the burdens these fallen women carry are contagious." The veiled threat hung in the air. Elias didn't move a muscle until the sound of the Reverend's horse faded into the distance. Then he closed the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Lydia was still shaking, silent tears streaming down her bruised cheeks. "He's gone," Elias said, his voice rough. Her lips trembled. "A good man," she whispered bitterly. "That's what they always call themselves." Elias felt the last of his doubt crumble into dust. He looked at the woman on his sofa, saw the raw terror in her eyes, and he knew. He knew she was telling the truth. The man who had prayed over his wife's grave was a monster, and he had just been inside Elias's home. That night, the fever took her. It came on suddenly, a prairie fire consuming her from the inside out. One minute she was sitting quietly, the next she was shivering uncontrollably, her skin burning to the touch. Elias knelt by her side, pressing a cool, damp cloth to her forehead. "Lord, help us," he prayed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. She began to mutter, her voice thick with delirium. Her words were broken, fragmented, but the names were clear. "Reverend Claiborne. Please, I won't tell. Mayor Redford, no, stop. Sheriff Wallace. You're supposed to protect people." Elias felt his blood run cold. It wasn't just the Reverend. It was all of them. The holy man, the lawman, the leader of the town, a trinity of evil, hiding in plain sight. He worked through the night, trying to bring the fever down, his mind a whirlwind of horror and rage. These weren't fever dreams. They were memories clawing their way to the surface. Sometime before dawn, her eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused, but they found his. "Are you a good man?" she asked, her voice a fragile rasp. The question hit him harder than a fist. He thought of his quiet life, his prayers, his hard work. He had always tried to be. "I try to be," he answered honestly. A broken, bitter laugh escaped her lips. "That's what they all say." Her eyes glistened with feverish tears. "Maybe God didn't bring me here so you could save me, Elias. Maybe he brought me here so you could finally see the truth about the men you worship. Before he could respond, her eyes rolled back, and she slipped into unconsciousness. Elias sat there in the dark, shaken to his core. Her words echoed in the silence. He could no longer deny it. The pillars of Amarillo were rotten to the core. By morning she was worse. Her breathing was shallow, a rattling sound in her chest. She hadn't eaten in days. She was fading, and she was still clinging to that damn blanket. "Lydia," he said, his voice urgent, "I have to help you. The fever is from infection. I have to see the wounds under the blanket." Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Promise me," she rasped, her eyes wild with fever and fear. "Promise you won't look." He stared into her eyes, saw the sheer terror there, and he nodded. "I promise." Her hand fell away, and she drifted off again. But Elias knew. It was a promise he had to break. Her life depended on it. That night, as Lydia tossed and moaned in her feverish sleep, Elias made his decision. He couldn't stand by and watch her die. Not now. Not when he knew what she had endured. He knelt by the sofa, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would wake her. "Forgive me, Lydia," he whispered, "but I can't let you die." His hands trembled as he reached for the edge of the blanket. He took a deep breath and pulled it back, and the world fell away. It wasn't just wounds. It was a history of brutality written on her skin. Scars, burns, cuts, each one a testament to an unspeakable evil. Elias felt sick. He had to look away, to fight back the bile rising in his throat. But it was what lay nestled in the folds of the wool that stopped his heart. It was evidence. A small, torn piece of a black vest, the kind the Reverend always wore, a single, ornate silver button, identical to the ones on Mayor Redford's Sunday coat, and a sheriff's badge, bent and stained with dried blood. Trophies. They had left her with trophies of their cruelty. And there was something else, a small, leather-bound journal. His hands shook as he picked it up. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise. The handwriting of a schoolteacher. Lydia Hart, the new schoolteacher who had arrived in Amarillo 6 months ago. The one who, according to town gossip, had simply vanished a few weeks back. Elias staggered backward, collapsing into his chair. He read the journal by the flickering lamplight, and with every word a piece of his soul died. It was all there. Dates, times, vile acts described in cold, clear detail. A systematic campaign of terror and abuse, orchestrated by the three most powerful men in town. They had used her, broken her, and when they were done, they had discarded her like trash, leaving her to die in the wilderness. They had underestimated her. They didn't know she was a fighter, they didn't know she had kept a record, and they didn't know she'd held on to the proof. When he finally looked up from the last page, his face was wet with tears he hadn't realized he was crying. The faith he had built his life on lay in ruins around him. The men he had respected, the God he had prayed to. It was all a lie. Lydia stirred, her lips moving. "Don't look," she whispered in her sleep. But he had looked, and he could never, ever unsee it. He bowed his head, the journal clutched in his hand like a fragile, holy relic. "Lord," he choked out, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "What am I supposed to do?" The only answer was the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. But in that moment, a new kind of faith was born in the ashes of the old one. It wasn't a faith in steeples or sermons. It was a cold, hard faith in justice. And Elias Monroe knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he would be its instrument. The reckoning for Amarillo was coming, and it was sleeping on his sofa. Dawn broke, painting the frosted windows in pale, ghostly shades of gray. Elias hadn't slept. He sat in his chair, the journal resting on his lap, a weight heavier than any stone. He looked at Lydia. Her face was slack, her breathing still shallow, but she was alive. She had survived hell, and now her fight had become his. He knew what he had to do. He built up the fire, boiled water, and gathered clean cloths. He knelt beside her again. "Lydia," he said softly, "I know. I looked." Her eyes fluttered open. They were dull with fever, but there was a flicker of awareness in them. She saw the journal in his lap, saw the truth in his face. A long, shuddering sigh escaped her lips. She was too weak to be angry, too tired to fight anymore. I had to, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I couldn't let you die. She just stared at him for a long moment, then gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod. It was a surrender, a transfer of trust. He spent the next hour carefully, gently, cleaning her wounds. Each scar he uncovered was a fresh stab of rage in his heart. He worked in silence, his hands steady despite the fury that coursed through him. He was no doctor, but he did what he could, bandaging her injuries with strips of clean linen. She trembled under his touch, but she didn't pull away. For the first time, she allowed herself to be cared for. When he was finished, he covered her with a fresh, clean blanket from Mary's old chest. Now you know, she murmured, her eyes closing with exhaustion. Now you know why I couldn't go to the sheriff? Or the reverend? Her voice was a bare whisper. No one believes a woman like me. I believe you, Elias said, his voice a raw promise. He took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around her fragile ones. Every single word. Tears welled in her eyes and traced paths through the grime on her cheeks. What are you going to do? He looked at the journal, at the damning evidence laid out on the table. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but I swear this to you, Lydia. They will never hurt you again. Not while I draw breath. Over the next few days, the fever broke. Color slowly returned to Lydia's cheeks. She started taking small spoonfuls of broth, then stew. The light came back into her eyes, though it was a different light now. Harder, wiser. The silence in the cabin changed. It was no longer a silence of fear and suspicion. It was a silence of shared purpose. A heavy, waiting silence. But every time Elias rode into town for supplies, the rage would boil up inside him again. He saw them, Claiborne, Redford, Wallace, strutting down the boardwalk, smiling, shaking hands, basking in the respect of a town they had poisoned with their lies. He saw the women of the town nod politely to the reverend, saw children look up in awe at the mayor. And Elias carried their filthy secret in his heart. It felt like swallowing broken glass. One day he overheard two women talking in the general store. Such a shame about that school teacher, Miss Hart, one said, clucking her tongue. Just up and ran off. They say she had loose morals. I'm not surprised, the other replied. A woman living alone, no family to speak of. She was bound for trouble. Elias gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to scream. He wanted to slam Lydia's journal down and force them to read the truth. But he held his tongue. It wasn't time. Not yet. When he got back to the ranch, Lydia saw the storm on his face. You saw them, she said. It wasn't a question. They're blaming you, he growled, slamming a sack of flour onto the table. They're turning you into the villain. She looked sad but not surprised. That's how they survive, Elias. They build their own reputations on the ruins of others. She paused, her gaze sharp and intelligent. There's no justice to be found in Amarillo. The law, the church, it's all in their hands. If you show them that journal, they'll burn it, and they'll bury us both. He knew she was right, but the thought of doing nothing was intolerable. Then we go beyond Amarillo, he said, a sudden clarity cutting through his anger. There are other laws, federal men, newspapers in Dallas, in Chicago, men who don't owe Claiborne a prayer or Redford a vote. A flicker of something sparked in Lydia's eyes. It was a dangerous, fragile thing. It was hope. They'll kill you if they find out, she whispered. Let them try, Elias said, his voice grim. That night a plan formed, a quiet, patient, and deadly plan. After Lydia was asleep, Elias sat at his desk. By the light of a single lamp, he began to write. He copied pages from Lydia's journal, his own hand steady and clear. He wrote letters, detailing the evidence, naming the names. He addressed them to U.S. Marshals, to Pinkerton agents, to the editors of the biggest newspapers in the country. He would not just expose them. He would set the world on fire around them. When he was done, he took the original journal and the evidence, the button, the badge, the cloth, and wrapped them in oilskin. He carried the bundle out behind the barn, to the old cottonwood tree where he and Mary had carved their initials years ago. He dug a deep hole beneath its roots and buried the truth. If they came for him, if they silenced him, the story would not die with him. Someone would find it. He returned to the cabin. Lydia was awake, watching the fire. "Do you still pray?" she asked him softly. Elias thought for a moment. "I do," he said, "but not to the God in Claiborne's church. I think. I think God is in the truth, Lydia, and he's been waiting a long time for it to be told in this town." For the first time since he'd found her, Lydia Hart gave him a small, genuine smile. The battle had begun. The whispers started like a low wind, rustling the dry leaves of Amarillo's complacency. At first, no one could trace their source. A comment here, a question there. Funny how the sheriff never found a trace of that missing school teacher. "Did you notice the Reverend sweating through his sermon last Sunday?" Elias heard them in the general store, at the blacksmith's, at the saloon. He said nothing. He just bought his supplies, his face a mask of stone, and rode back to the ranch. He was a sower of seeds, and he was content to wait for the harvest. He'd sent the letters out in staggered batches, using traders and mail coaches, heading in different directions. He knew it was only a matter of time before the fire he'd lit on the horizon reached Amarillo. Lydia was growing stronger. The haunted look in her eyes was being replaced by a quiet resolve. She had stopped hiding behind blankets and shawls. She started helping Elias with small chores around the cabin, her movements becoming more confident each day. They didn't talk much about what was coming. They didn't have to. It was a storm they would face together. Then one afternoon, the sheriff came to call. Elias saw him riding up, a single ominous figure against the wide-open sky. Sheriff Wallace didn't look like a man coming for a friendly visit. "Monroe," Wallace said, not even bothering to dismount. His eyes were cold and hard as river stones. "Got a report of stolen cattle over at the Miller place. Thought I'd ask if you've seen any strangers passing through." It was a lie. Elias knew it. The Miller ranch was 50 miles in the other direction. Wallace was here to sniff around, to intimidate. "Haven't seen a soul," Elias said, his voice calm, his hand resting casually on the axe handle beside the woodpile. Wallace's gaze drifted to the cabin, to the flicker of movement behind the window, where Lydia had quickly stepped back. "Heard you've got company," the sheriff said, his voice laced with insinuation. "Some folks are saying you took in that runaway school teacher." "I took in a woman I found half dead on my land," Elias said, his eyes locking with the sheriff's. "It's the Christian thing to do. The Reverend himself said so." He let the name hang in the air between them. A muscle twitched in Wallace's jaw. He had expected fear. He had expected Elias to stammer and fold. He had not expected this quiet, unmovable defiance. "You be careful, Monroe," Wallace snarled, his mask of authority slipping. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Some things are best left buried." "I agree," Elias said evenly, "but some things have a way of crawling out of the grave all on their own." The sheriff stared at him for a long, tense moment, then wheeled his horse around and galloped away, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the air like a dirty shroud. Elias went back inside, his heart hammering. Lydia was standing by the hearth, her face pale. "He knows," she whispered. "He suspects," Elias corrected her, "and he's scared. That's why he came." The visit from Wallace was the first crack in the dam. The next came a week later, in the form of a newspaper from Dallas. It was just a small article, buried on an inside page. It spoke of disturbing rumors of corruption and depravity in a small, unnamed Texas panhandle town. It mentioned a missing woman and the alleged involvement of high-ranking community officials. No names were mentioned, but everyone in Amarillo knew. The town began to buzz. The whispers grew louder, more pointed. People started looking at Claiborne, Redford, and Wallace differently. The respect they had commanded for years began to curdle into suspicion. Mayor Redford tried to laugh it off, calling it yellow journalism from city folk who looked down on them. But his laughter sounded hollow. Reverend Claiborne preached a fiery sermon on the evils of gossip in bearing false witness. But the congregation just stared back at him, their faces grim and questioning. Elias watched it all unfold from a distance. He and Lydia had created an earthquake, and now they were feeling the tremors. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lydia spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "They won't just let their world collapse, Elias. They'll fight back. They'll try to destroy the source of the story. You mean us, he said. She nodded. They'll try to prove I'm a liar, or that I'm crazy. They will try to ruin you for helping me. Let them, Elias said, his face set like granite. The truth is buried under the cottonwood tree, and more of it is spreading across this country with every mail coach that leaves town. He looked at her, at the quiet strength that had replaced the fear. Their power comes from people believing their lies. We just have to make sure no one believes them anymore. He didn't know how right he was, or how violent the end of their reign would be. The first real shot was fired not with a gun, but with a pen. A letter arrived for Elias, bearing the seal of the Amarillo Town Council. It was a summons. He was ordered to appear before the council, chaired by Mayor Redford, to answer questions regarding the harboring of a fugitive. They were trying to turn Lydia into the criminal. It's a trap, Lydia said, her voice tight with anxiety. If you go in there, they'll twist your words. They'll have Wallace arrest you on some trumped-up charge. If I don't go, they'll claim I'm hiding, that I have something to fear, Elias countered. He paced the small cabin, his mind racing. They want to isolate us, make this a he said, she said, against the most powerful men in town. He stopped and looked at her. But it's not just our word anymore, is it? 2 days later, Elias rode into Amarillo. He didn't go to the town hall. Instead, he went to the telegraph office. He sent a single coded message to a journalist in Dallas he had been corresponding with. The harvest is ready. Bring the reapers. Then he rode to the town hall. The council room was packed. Redford sat at the head of the table, flanked by a nervous-looking Reverend Claiborne. Sheriff Wallace stood by the door, his hand resting on his pistol. It was an ambush dressed up as a legal proceeding. Elias Monroe, Redford began, his voice booming with false authority. You stand accused of obstructing justice by hiding the woman known as Lydia Hart, who is wanted for questioning in her own disappearance and for spreading malicious slander against the leadership of this community. A murmur went through the crowd. Elias stood tall. The only crime Lydia Hart is guilty of is surviving, he said, his voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the room. The slander you speak of is the truth, a truth I have here, in her own words. He held up a copy of Lydia's journal. Redford paled. That is a forgery, a madwoman's ravings. Then let's ask her, a voice called from the back of the room. The crowd parted. Lydia stood in the doorway. She was not the broken creature Elias had found by the chapel. She was dressed in a simple, clean dress. Her head was held high, her eyes clear and burning with a righteous fire. The townspeople gasped. They had been told she was a harlot who had run away. They saw a survivor who had returned. I am not a fugitive, Lydia said, her voice shaking but strong. I am a victim of the men sitting at that table. She began to speak. She told them everything, the details from her journal, the acts of unspeakable cruelty. She spoke of the vest cloth, the silver button, the bloody badge. Reverend Claiborne leaped to his feet. Lies, vicious lies from a fallen woman. Then prove it, Lydia challenged, her voice ringing with conviction. Show the congregation your vest. Show them the spot where a piece is missing. Let the mayor show us the buttons on his coat. Let the sheriff explain the blood on his badge. The room erupted. The council lost control. People were shouting, demanding answers. Redford was stammering, his face crimson. Wallace looked like a cornered wolf. It was in that moment of chaos that the doors to the town hall swung open again. 2 men stood there. They wore city clothes and hard, implacable expressions. One of them held up a badge that glinted in the light. U.S. Marshals, the man announced, his voice cutting through the noise like a razor. We've come to investigate some very serious allegations against the leadership of this town. He held up a copy of the Dallas newspaper. And it looks like we've arrived right on time. The trap had been sprung, but not by Redford. It was Elias's trap, and the wolves of Amarillo had just walked right into it. The presence of the federal marshals changed everything. The power dynamic in Amarillo shattered in an instant. Redford's blustering, Claiborne's piety, Wallace's intimidation. It all evaporated under the cold, impartial gaze of a higher authority. The head marshal, a man named Dawson, took control of the room with quiet, unshakable confidence. This is now a federal matter, he announced. My men will be securing all records from the town hall, the sheriff's office, and the church. He turned his attention to the three men at the table, who now looked less like leaders and more like prisoners in the dock. Reverend Claiborne, Mayor Redford, Sheriff Wallace, you will accompany me for questioning, now. There was no room for argument. Wallace, who had built his career on the threat of violence, now found himself disarmed and escorted out of the room like a common criminal. Redford sputtered protests that were ignored. Claiborne simply collapsed into his chair, his face a mask of utter ruin. The people of Amarillo watched in stunned silence. Their world had been turned upside down in the space of an hour. The men they had trusted, honored, and obeyed were being led away, their reputations in tatters. Marshal Dawson then turned to Elias and Lydia. His expression softened slightly. Mr. Monroe, he said, your telegram was most timely, and Miss Hart, your courage is remarkable. He looked at the journal Elias was still holding. I believe this, and some other evidence you mentioned, belongs to us now. That afternoon, Elias led the marshals out to his ranch. He took them to the old cottonwood tree and, with a heavy heart, he dug up the oilskin bundle. He handed over the journal, the button, the badge, and the cloth. The truth was no longer his secret to protect. It belonged to the law now. The investigation was swift and brutal. The marshals were methodical, interviewing townspeople, examining records, and piecing together the timeline of Lydia's torment. The evidence was overwhelming. The journal, corroborated by the physical proof, and the men's own panicked, contradictory statements, sealed their fate. Amarillo was forced to look at the evil it had allowed to fester in its heart. The whispers of gossip were replaced by the cold, hard facts of the federal report. There was no more room for doubt. The pillars of the community had not just fallen, they had crumbled into dust. Redford and Wallace were charged with a litany of federal crimes. They would spend the rest of their lives in a federal prison far from the town they had once ruled. Reverend Claiborne, facing the utter destruction of his life and soul, chose a different path. The night before he was to be arrested, he went to the new church, the one Elias had never trusted, and hanged himself from the bell rope. In the end, justice came. Not the clean, simple justice of a Sunday sermon, but a messy, painful, and necessary reckoning. A few months later, when the dust had settled, Lydia came to Elias. She was leaving. There are too many ghosts for me here, she said, looking out at the endless plains. I need to find a place where I'm not that woman from the trial. A place where I can just be Lydia. Elias understood. He drove her to the station himself. They stood on the platform, the silence between them comfortable, full of unspoken understanding. You saved my life, Elias, she said, turning to him. You saved mine too, he replied, and he meant it. She had woken him from the slumber of his quiet, lonely faith and shown him what it truly meant to fight for what was right. She boarded the train, and he watched it pull away, shrinking into a black speck on the horizon, until it was gone. Elias returned to his ranch, to the silence. But it was a different silence now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the memory of a fight won, of a truth brought into the light. He still worked his land, still mended his fences, still lived his quiet life. But he was not the same man. He had learned that faith wasn't about hiding in a church. It was about standing up in the middle of town and speaking the truth, no matter the cost. He learned that the worst monsters don't have claws or fangs. They wear badges and clerical collars. And he learned that sometimes the greatest act of prayer is to believe someone when no one else will. The story of Elias Monroe and Lydia Hart became a quiet legend in that part of Texas, a reminder that even in the darkest places, the courage of two ordinary people can be enough to bring down an empire of lies. If you believe that truth is always worth fighting for, no matter how powerful the liars are, then do me a favor. Hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. We've got more stories coming that you won't want to miss.